All right. So as I said in our intro lecture, we're going to start right around the year 1300 as kind of the main jumping off point for this class. But before we get there, and we talk about this remarkable 14th century, which is the main subject of this lecture, we got to fill in some of the background and talk a little bit of how we get to that point. How does Europe get to where it is in the 14th century? So we're going to dip back. I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can. But in the opening lecture, I talked about the Roman Empire and kind of modern Europe, and as other parts of the world, North Africa and the Near East, is really in many ways a fragmented result of what the Roman Empire once was. If we go back to the year 117 AD or CE. That's the year in which the Roman Empire kind of reaches its geographic limit. That is, the empire is, in terms of its territory, the biggest and most unified to some degree that it ever was. So all the territories you see here in the pink and the green were all kind of smaller states which made up the larger Roman Empire. And so this is an era where, again, you had the emperor in Rome ruling over all of this territory, over all of these millions of people. And it's after this, as we get into that 3rd century, particularly AD, the 200s, it quickly starts to fall apart and fragment. So this is the kind of the Roman Empire at its height, at its most unified, at its most together, perhaps at its most influential. And then we start to kind of go on the downslope on the other side of this. So an important story to tell. So in that 3rd century, in the 200s, you start to have all kinds of political infighting. If you look at the list of emperors and kind of how long they ruled, you have dozens of emperors who rule for like 1 or 2 years, largely because of rivals plotting, assassinating, backstabbing. You have rival emperors. You have many people kind of claiming that they are the true heir to the Roman throne. And you can see how a massive empire like this would not last long in terms of that kind of political intrigue going on. Now, things come around. Things become unified kind of briefly once again under the banner of this guy that you see in this painting here. And this is Constantine, or sometimes he's called Constantine the Great. And he comes to power in the early 300s, the early 4th century AD, CE. And he's a remarkable figure, and he's sometimes pointed to as kind of the last emperor who kind of holds together the Roman Empire in some kind of unified fashion for the last time. But as we'll see, he already seems to recognize that this massive territory can't hold together under the power of one man anymore, and he even starts to divide it up, and because he takes his whole entourage out of Rome and to the new city built and named after himself, Constantinople. But he's a very important figure for not just for the politics of the era, and the culture, but for kind of understanding the place of religion and the Christian religion as it's established and as it spreads throughout Europe. And so, as we'll see when we start talking about the 14th century, the figure of the Pope, the Catholic Pope, is an absolutely essential figure in this era, for better and for worse. And so we need to explain a little bit, how did the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, become to be so powerful, roughly kind of 1,000 years after the figure you're looking at here? Well, there's this famous story that Constantine, he's one of a handful of figures that are claiming to be the emperor of Rome. And as it usually happens, it comes down to warfare. It comes down to violence is going to decide this issue. So long story short, it comes down between Constantine and this other guy by the name of Maxentius. And Maxentius is also claiming the throne, and neither one's going to back down. And they gather their forces on either side of the Tiber River, just north of the city of Rome. And the famous story that about this goes something like this: is that the night before the battle, and one of the nights before the battle, Constantine has a vision, and that's what this painting is kind of telling this story. And in that vision, he sees something. He sees some sort of symbol of the Christian faith. Now, again, at this point, the Christian faith had been spreading kind of throughout the Middle East and throughout Europe, but it was often persecuted Christians were often persecuted by various Roman emperors, but it was slowly spreading and growing, but it hadn't attained any kind of legal recognition and certainly no kind of political power yet. Well, Constantine sees in this vision some kind of symbol of the Christian God. Here it's depicted as the cross, perhaps the best known symbol of Christianity. But in Constantine's day, the cross had not yet become a symbol for early Christians. And he sees also the words in the sky, something like translated into English, "In this sign you will conquer." And he comes out of this vision or a dream or whatever it was, and he's convinced that he's had a remarkable kind of divine experience. So what he does is he paints the symbol. Most people think it was probably a combination of the Greek letters chi and rho, kind of a CH and R together, the first two letters of the name Christ in Greek. And he has that painted on all of his men's shields. And they go out into battle, and it's a rout. He decimates Maxentius. Maxentius himself is thrown off his horse. He drowns in the river, and his forces are scattered. And Constantine is left as the last man standing and as the undisputed emperor of Rome. And he rules Rome, like I said, in kind of its last quasi-unified fashion for the next 30 years. And one of the first things that he does is that he legalizes Christianity, which had been kind of on the books as an illegal kind of anti-Roman religion. In various emperors kind of paid attention to it and didn't pay attention to it as they saw fit. But Constantine, with this famous edict, he legalizes Christianity, which allows kind of the Christian faith to come out of the shadows. And then Constantine himself, although there's a lot of debate about it, he on his deathbed he's baptized into the Christian faith, and it's under Constantine that Christianity makes this massive leap forward and comes out in a fairly short time to become a massive cultural force. So one of the many things that Constantine does to kind of solidify his interest in or his belief in this Christian God is that he starts to gather up kind of relics. He's very interested in kind of the bones of saints and figures from the biblical literature. He sends his mother off to Palestine, to Jerusalem, to find elements and places from the life of Christ and to gather up pieces of the true cross and such. And in Rome, where Constantine is at this moment, he hears stories that Peter, the famous disciple, as well as Paul, the famous apostle, were martyred, were killed, were murdered in Rome right around the same time under the Emperor Nero. And Nero famously, after this massive fire that burns kind of 2/3 of Rome, that's what you're looking at here, is a map of Rome. The people start to blame Nero for the fire, and Nero panics, and he in turn blames the Christians, this kind of this small group, kind of this fringe group in Rome at the time. We're talking in the 60s AD right now. And he persecutes them. He rounds them up, and he has them killed and tortured and burned and thrown to wild animals and the like. And the story goes is that in this circus here that I have kind of colored red, so you see Circus Neronianus, the circus meaning here just stadium. In this area, in this stadium, it's thought that Nero made a spectacle of a lot of these martyrs, and so some of these early Christians were killed and crucified, beheaded, tortured for public entertainment. It was a horrific scene. And it's thought that Peter himself, the disciple of Christ, who was in Rome at the time, was rounded up and was actually martyred here. The famous kind of quasi-legend is that he was crucified upside down by his own request because he felt he wasn't worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. And he's crucified there, and his body is thrown into a pauper's grave, basically right across the street from where he was killed in this circus. And this today is where Vatican City is, and I'll explain why. And so I'm sure many of you have seen pictures, maybe some of you have even traveled there, I don't know. Kind of the famous Vatican Square, which is really an oval, which kind of leads to St. Peter's Church. This is the massive dome of St. Peter's Church. This is the Vatican, which is kind of its own little country inside of Rome here, right? And this is where the Pope lives, and this is where the Pope will hold Mass and all kinds of other things going But why is this church here? Why is the seat of the Pope here? Well, it's because of what Constantine did. He follows kind of local traditions, and he discovers that there is a particular grave, long before any of the stuff that you see here was here, that was venerated as the grave of Peter. And what Constantine does, he again, like I said, he's very interested in these sacred, holy sites and kind of the use of ritual, not ritual, but relics and bones and objects that could kind of consecrate an area. Constantine is very interested in that kind of idea. And so he decides he's going to build kind of, the capital T, capital H, capital E, the Catholic Christian church in Rome. And it's going to be the bones of Peter that are going to consecrate this whole area. So ultimately, what he does is, again, here's kind of, again, if you go to the Vatican today, there's nothing left of the Stadium of Nero that you can see. But this kind of shows what Constantine did and how they were aligned. So here's where the stadium was, and then right across, kind of the paved Roman street, the Via Cornelia, there was this cemetery. And in that cemetery was this humble little tomb that tradition had it. Again, this would have been, almost 300 years, 250 years before Constantine himself. There'd been a long tradition of Christians kind of quietly going to this tomb and praying there and leaving graffiti behind and venerating this tomb because this is where Peter's bones were. And so what he does is what Constantine does, he plows under what was left of the circus and buries this whole cemetery in dirt. And he builds this church on top of this large, massive dirt foundation. It was a huge engineering feat. And he builds this first St. Peter's Church, which is not the one you see today. That's the church you see in the Vatican today is the second St. Peter's Cathedral. But he builds it, and so that the apse at the back of the church. So here would have been the front of the church. We're in a courtyard here. And then inside the church would have been the place for worshipers to come in. And then in the apse is the kind of the holy altar, which was built above. It was meant to kind of align with St. Peter's tomb. And so the bones of Peter then give consecration to that place. Now, there had been, before all of this happens, there had been, I guess technically you would call a pope, kind of a leader in Rome of the local faithful. But it's after Constantine builds this church and legalizes Christianity that we start to get kind of the era of the popes. And now popes are, elected and consecrated in the Vatican, and then they run this church and kind of rule the church from this area. And over the next several centuries, over the next 1,000 years, they gain quite a bit of not only spiritual power, but temporal, political power as well. So here's a drawing of what it may have looked like. Kind of here you see kind of the remains of Nero's circus. In the middle of the spine, or it was originally when Nero wasn't killing and torturing people. This was a stadium used for horse racing. They would race around the oval, around this what the Romans called the spine. And in the middle of that spine was an obelisk that had been brought over to Rome from Egypt. And that's the obelisk that still stands in Vatican Square today. And so it's thought right across the street here, you would have had this cemetery with a number of these crypts. It looks like a neighborhood, but all these little buildings here are crypts for family tombs. And among these was kind of this small, very humble tomb, which is believed to be that of the disciple of the apostle Peter. Here's a drawing of Constantine's first church. We have a decent idea of what it looked like, kind of its shape and its scope. It does not survive today. It started to fall down in the 1500s, and the Pope from that era decides, okay, it's not worth patching this thing up again, and we're going to build a new church, a more massive and more ornate and glorious church. It's another one of these results of the Renaissance of that era. So this church you see here is ultimately knocked down, and the church that you see in Vatican Square today, with Michelangelo who designed this massive dome over it, it kind of covers the ruins and the remains of Constantine's church, and then below that is this first century cemetery, which Catholics believe holds the bones of Peter's. And so the dome here is aligned in the church directly over the main altar. And if you go down about kind of 40 feet below ground, it's been excavated. I've visited many times. It's incredible. You can walk through the street of that ancient cemetery, and when you go down there, a priest will take you through, and it culminates in kind of a peek around the corner where you can see these lucite boxes Every time I've gone, they make a big point to say these were designed by NASA, which I find is really interesting. And in those lucite boxes, they are kept the bones, or what I believed to be the bones of St. Peter. All right. Okay, so what Constantine does, one of the things he does, so in addition to all of that stuff, he kind of packs up his whole government, so to speak, moves it from Rome to his new city of Constantinople. And what Constantine recognizes is that the western part of the empire here in the kind of the tan or the orange here is quickly becoming a backwater. You're having these invasions of barbarian tribes from the north, or barbarians as the Romans thought them, and kind of coming in and taking over areas. And Constantine, in some cases, says it's not worth defending anymore. So while this is still kind of technically part of the Roman Empire, it's quickly falling apart and falling prey to a number of tribes. And Constantine recognized, that the money, the power, the influence is all in what, from this point of view, is the East. And this ultimately becomes what's known as the Byzantine Empire, which is kind of the inheritance of what was the Roman Empire. And you can see here all of the kind of the Western Empire starts to break apart and becomes kind of these smaller kingdoms to different tribes and different ethnic groups and different language groups. In the kingdom of the Franks, you can see the word French in there, starts to kind of solidify. And kind of the last gasp of the Roman Empire is this Byzantine unity around what we would call Greece today, Turkey, Palestine, Israel, and Egypt. And then kind of fast forward again through the early part of the Middle Ages, things start to fragment more and more and more. Kind of territory is starting to kind of creep down into the Byzantine Empire. It's hanging on, you can see, but it's running out of gas. And you can start to see the other parts of Europe becoming more familiar. If you were to glance at a map of Europe today, you'd see things you recognize: France and Spain and Portugal and England and Scotland and Ireland and Poland and Hungary. It's starting to kind of take on that shape that is more recognizable to us today. All right. Okay. So, I skimmed over a ton there, but that's more or less kind of gives us a little bit of a brief background to get us to what is sometimes called by academics the Trecento, which is just Italian, 1300, this 14th century. And it's a brutal century. And so one of the really interesting questions that we'll tackle here or ponder here is that these 1300s, the 14th century, the Trecento, is often called the so-called gateway to the Renaissance, this flowering of culture and art and beauty and architecture and knowledge and writing and literature that kind of dominates Europe, especially Italy, in the 1500s, the next century, or the 1400s and the 1500s, next two centuries. You have this rebirth of these classical Greek and Roman ideals, philosophy and art and literature, language, as well as kind of these stirrings of humanism, democracy, and individualism. Sometimes I think we associate, I think too quickly, kind of these ideals of democracy are born in things like the American and French Revolution. Not really. I mean, this goes back centuries. In many ways, the American and French Revolution are building upon some of these revolutionary ideas that are coming out in these last gasps of the medieval period. So how does this happen? So as we'll see, the Trecento, the 1300s, is a brutal century. War, disorder, destruction, chaos, disease. This is the era of the famous Black Plague, the Bubonic Plague. And so an important question to ask ourselves is, how could all of this disorder, all of these horrors, lay the groundwork for this blossoming of the Renaissance? And there's no easy answer to that question. I'm not claiming to be able to give you an answer to that question. But I think one of the things we're going to do in this class is kind of consider these kind of rhythms of history. Does history have a rhythm? Does it kind of go through waves that are predictable to some sense, or not? This is very important to kind of, I think, to our understanding of kind of how one thing comes out of another. All right, so the first thing that we're going to tackle is this huge problem in amongst the Roman Catholic Church, and who is the Pope? And in this case, we'll see how many popes can there be. And so is this major divide within the church itself called the Great Schism. And we're mainly going to be talking about kind of the so-called Second Great Schism, which happens in the latter part of the 14th and early part of the 15th century. All right, so going way back, there was an earlier schism. You can see the date up here. In 1054, the Holy Roman Catholic Church it divides in two. It's a divide that still exists today. So if you know something about religious history, or if you're religious yourself, you might know that there is the kind of the Roman Catholic Church, which is still kind of based in Rome or in the Vatican under the Pope. And then there's also the Eastern Church, or sometimes called the Eastern Orthodox Church, that splits in two. And it goes back to wrestling about kind of how much authority should the Pope have. The Eastern Church said, leave us alone. We want to do our own thing. While the Roman Catholic Church kind of vested its authority in the Pope. A big issue was within worship and in ritual, the use of images and icons. Should they be used? Should they not be used? Is it can we depict God or Jesus in paintings and in pictures? So lots of disagreements on just kind of the nuts and bolts of how does one go about worshiping within the sanctuary, and the two sides could not agree. Liturgical practices, the place of music, the use of chants, of prayers, of incense, all of these things. There were strident differences between these two sides. And those, I would say today the two sides are much closer together than they were way back when. There is still this marked divide between the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Orthodox Church. One of the major issues in some sense came down to one single word, this Latin word filioque, which is actually you translate it with two words, and, or three words, and the Son. And kind of a big difference on kind of how the two sides of the church decided on, how do we understand the figure of Jesus? So filioque means, and the Son referring to Jesus. If you know something about Christian doctrine, there is a Christian doctrine which is called the doctrine of the Trinity. And that's mainly kind of a Western church, or here it's called the Latin church. This idea that God is one, but one of the mysteries of God is that God is in three persons that are all equal to one another. You have God the Father, you have God the Son, through the figure of Jesus, and God the Holy Spirit. And so in the Western church, in the Catholic Church, the idea is that it's kind of a triangle. None is greater than the other. They are all kind of equal facets of this mystery of the Christian Trinity. Well, in the Eastern Church, they said, well, almost, but not quite. They put a primacy on kind of the persona of God the Father. And I'm going to see if I can get a laser pointer. Yeah, it's better. God the Father. And this idea that the language is that the Holy Spirit and the Son proceed from the Father. So there's kind of a hierarchy. Now, at a glance, that might seem like that's not that big of a deal. But when it comes down to kind of theological issues and doctrine, this is huge. And so this was a place where, in terms of doctrine and kind of really understanding what is the persona of God, the two sides simply could not agree. So fast forward. So there's already the split going way back, almost 400 years later. We have the second split, which it causes great turmoil during this 14th century. So by the time we get to that 14th century, the Roman Catholic Church is the institution of medieval Europe, dominating in a way that, even though there was the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church is far outpacing it in terms of its influence. But it's during this Trecento, during these 1300s, it undergoes tremendous upheavals and ultimately a reorganization, which I think will at the end of this, you'll see kind of we're starting to get towards a more kind of democratic type of approach to not just the church, but to culture in general. All right, so what's the story here? So in the year 1300, Pope Boniface VII celebrates a jubilee. So every 50 years, the Catholic Church celebrates what's called a jubilee, and it's a big it's a big to-do in Rome, but it's a time of pilgrimage where people gather together, and there's back in the day it was a lot of spending a lot of money on the populace, building new things, being patrons of art. But during this particular jubilee in the year 1300, Pope Boniface VII announces in Rome, that he says, yes, the papacy to this point has been mostly kind of a spiritual power. I am the head of the Catholic Church. But in this jubilee, he claimed temporal power, political power. And he says, not only should the Pope be a spiritual leader, but should be a political leader. And this starts kind of this long era of popes holding political power, commanding armies and such, which in terms of, if you think of like Pope Francis today, unthinkable. But the Pope was kind of a king in and of itself, and Boniface kind of makes that officially proclaimed during this era. Well, some of the local kings didn't like that. Said, no, stay in your place, Mr. Pope. And so King Philip of France in particular, who was arguably at this time the most influential and powerful of those kind of fragmented kingdoms, shows how much he didn't like this. He has Boniface more or less kind of rounded up and beat within an inch of his life, and basically saying, stay in your corner, Pope. And not only this, King Philip is so upset that under kind of further kind of economic and military pressures, he says, I'm not even going to have the papacy, the Pope, be in Rome anymore. He says, I want it closer to home, and moves it to Avignon, which was within French territory, and says, okay, this is the new Vatican, so to speak, in his territory. Again, unthinkable in terms of this long institution of the papacy thus far. So here's Avignon here, again, roughly around the time of the Great Schism. And so Boniface is, he's beat up in Rome. The King of France, Philip, says, no, I'm going to take the whole papacy and I'm going to have it right underneath my balcony here in Avignon so I can keep track of what's going on. And you start to see a divide. And now you have, ultimately now there's two popes. There's an Avignon pope, kind of under the thumb of the King of France, and there's still the pope at Rome. And now these other kingdoms have to decide, okay, who are we going to side with? Which pope do we recognize? And so in choosing one pope over the other, you immediately are kind of declaring not just spiritual alliance, you're declaring political alliance as well. So this is a massive deal. And so the papacy in Avignon stays there for 70 years. Back in Italy, the local Italians, deeply proud that, on the boot of their territory, the Vatican is, St. Peter's is, the bones of Peter are. So there's massive anger of Philip's move of taking the papacy and moving it just as more of kind of a political move than anything. 1377, Pope Gregory XI, he ultimately brings the papacy back to Rome in a great pomposity, but he dies right after that, so he can't really kind of carry through his plans. And there's still a split among the cardinals. So if you know something about Catholic kind of organization, the Pope is at the top, and the cardinals are the next rank right below them. And so when one pope dies and they have to elect another pope, the new pope is taken from that group of cardinals. So they have a lot of power within the church. And the cardinals themselves are split. Some are saying, yes, a long time coming. The papacy should have been here all along. But some say, no, Avignon, it's been here, we were established here, and things should stay here for perpetuity. And so it's a huge mess. So ultimately under pressure from the Italian mobs and political pressure from France, even the kings of France recognize, okay, we have to come to some kind of compromise here. And so what they do is they elect a new pope, Urban VI, who you see here, Urbanus Papa Neapolitanus. He was Pope Urban VI, who was the pope from Naples, Neapolis. And so he served at Avignon, which again would have irritated the Italians, but he himself isn't Italian. He's from Naples. And so they thought that, okay, this is a guy who kind of bridge that divide. But so people think, okay, finally, this is agreed. We have one pope back in Rome, and we can move forward from here. But Urban VI himself, he's very bad at diplomacy, and he deals really harshly and sometimes deadly with people who opposed him. And so it's just another kind of bloody mess. And Avignon says, okay, well, this is where you're going to be, Urban. We're going to elect a rival pope of our own. So they elect Clement VII. He attempts to march on Rome with his own army to retake it under kind of the banner again of one papacy. Doesn't work. So he says, I'll just go back to Avignon, and I'll be pope in Avignon, and Urban will be pope in Rome. So you can see nothing has been settled yet. And so you get, yes, a good old-fashioned pope fight. For almost 40 years, you have these two rival popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome. And like I said, it's not just a spiritual thing. It's not just a religion thing. Is by taking sides, you're kind of deciding what your political allegiances are as well. All right, so this is kind of more or less how it breaks down. France, Spain, and Scotland, they side with Clement the Seventh in Avignon. Italy, England, and Germany side with Urban the Sixth, and you can start to see even kind of the bubblings of war and conflict along these lines starting to make themselves known. And again, so the ones I have listed here, certainly not all of those territories, but kind of the main political and military powers of this era. So it's not just a religious split, it's a social split, it's a political split, it's a military split, cultural split, and leads to lots of violence and confusion and death and disorder. Now add to this, it gets even worse in the city of Pisa, also in Italy, most famous today for its Leaning Tower. They kind of a local religious council gets together and says, we don't like the Pope in Rome or the Pope in Avignon. We're going to elect our own Pope. And so they elect a Pope by the name of Alexander V. And so by the time you get to the year 1409, early 15th century, you have 3 rival popes. And so again, just emblematic of the disorder and chaos of this era. So finally, the church gets its stuff together enough to recognize we've got to solve this problem. A major council is called. The Pope in Pisa, the Pope in Avignon are deposed, and with the agreement that Gregory XII, who was the Pope in Rome by this point, he's going to resign. So we're going to start with a clean slate. And then the conclave, which is just a word used for the cardinals getting together to elect a new pope, they get together and they elect Martin V, who is a much better diplomat than Pope Urban was. And he rules as pope for the next, you can see here, for the next 14 years. And he's the first sole pope, only pope to rule in Rome, in the Vatican, for the first time in about 40 years. Now, what comes out of this? It's not just the church recognizes, okay, we've got our one pope back in Rome, but they also recognize we can't go back to the way it was. And so a lot of things come out of this. A restrained papacy. The Pope is recognized, yes, as the most important spiritual leader within the Catholic Church, but he's not a monarch. He's not a king. Now, we'll see this doesn't fully go away. But this idea that the Pope should be both kind of a king commanding armies and also being the ruler, the spiritual ruler, is at the very least deeply questioned and starts to fragment, and this monarchical power of the Pope starts to fall away. Now, we'll see when we talk about the 1500s, this is a long death, as it were, kind of a long fade out, but it really changes here. A redefinition of the papacy as a ministerial authority who is to work for the good of the church and the faithful, kind of redefining the Pope. Let's getting back to the roots. Who is the Pope? Well, the Pope is a minister, not a leader, and so stick to that as your most important job. A call to the community of believers to keep and hold their church ministers accountable and honorable. So, as the Pope's political power lessens, there is a rise in the power of the community of believers, kind of a check. And so you can kind of see we're kind of getting towards a kind of democracy. There are open up channels for communities of believers to exercise power through councils. So things that where the Pope in the past would have done with just like I decree it and therefore it is. Now you have these local councils making kind of church decisions as well. And so we're starting to see kind of the bubblings of a kind of representative democracy, as it were. I mean, we're light years away from the American Constitution or the French Constitution, but we're seeing the seedlings here. And so, yes, throughout the next centuries, councils become more powerful. And so broadly speaking, and again, this takes centuries to accomplish, there is this move away from monarchy and towards a kind of democracy where things are decided by the group rather than the individual. Now, another kind of massive conflict that is centered in this 14th century, the Trecento, is the so-called 100 Years' War, which you can see by its dates was actually longer. It was 116 years of war. And this is a massive conflict between England and France. England and France have long been rivals, long before this. And actually, you could even say to terms that now today, in kind of culturally speaking, not militarily speaking, there is still a rivalry between Britain and France. But this tension goes all the way back to 1066 in the famous Battle of Hastings, where William the Conqueror, a Frenchman, invades and captures England. And kind of the violence and the sway of influence and rulership goes back and forth for many, many centuries. And what complicates the fact is that, one of the ways that, major powers would establish treaties with one another is they would say, okay, um, hey, England would say, hey, France, how about a daughter from your royal family will marry a son from our royal family, and vice versa. And so you have this intermarriage between these royal families as a way of kind of solidifying agreements and treaties and peace between these two sides. But all this also causes, great confusion down the line between, you do this for enough centuries, you can say, okay, well, whose bloodline gets to decide who's what, follow the queen here, follow the king there. And so there's, by the time we get to the 14th century, there's a huge amount of confusion as to kind of, well, who actually owns what and who should rule where, particularly in kind of familial royal family holdings, who actually owns this territory. And the final straw was in 1328, the King of France dies, and without leaving an heir behind. And England, or particularly Edward III, King of England, he sees his chance. And he says, okay, the King of France didn't leave an heir behind, and so I'm going to claim the right to rule both England and France from England. So basically saying, okay, France, you don't have a king anymore, so I'll take the reins. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't go over so well with the French. And they reject this, and they declare war. And it formally kind of breaks out a number of years later in 1337, and this war lasts for 116 years. Now, I found this really interesting image, which kind of shows kind of the phases of the 116 years war. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, Phase 4. And what I find so kind of interesting, kind of unintentionally funny, but also really depressing. So look at, this is the kind of the territories that were held as the war began. And it's more or less, again, if you know your map of Europe, it's more or less of kind of what we think of England today and what we think of France today. It's the territory of France is a little bit bigger today, but the territory is roughly the same. And the only difference here is that you can see these minor, in the green, these minor holdings, English holdings in French territory at this time. So as the war goes on, England starts to make headway, starts to claim more territory in France. It's going well. France pushes back. English pushes from the north down. They start to conquer this territory in the north of France. But by the time we get to the end, 116 years later, you can see the where it began and where it ended is almost exactly the same. If you want, in terms of territory, you might say that the French won because they get this little territory back here and this territory here as well. And it's very close, like I said, to what we think of the territory which bounds England and France today. So what was accomplished in these 116 years of war? Absolutely brutal, with ultimately not much change of territory, passing through different hands. But some very important legacies to this war. The kind of question, who won, England, France, both? I think both sides kind of claimed victory just so they could get the whole thing over with. But what was accomplished by this? Well, what you did have at the end is a much clearer idea of what's English and what's French. A much clearer idea of who the English royal family is and who the French royal family is. No more intermarriage. And so you had a much more kind of defined sense of nationality and territory. Again, it was the confusion over that which kind of led to this war to begin with. But now you have English territory with English kings, English queens with their standing army, and the same thing happening on the French side of things across the English Channel. Another thing, so we talked about with the papal schism, when we finally get one pope back in Rome. One of the consequences of that is a more democratic approach. Councils need to have more power than just the pope. Another kind of democratizing thing happens during this war is that you were starting to see kind of the 14th century is kind of an age of invention, and it's during this war that war. You might have heard the phrase "necessity is the mother of invention." Like if a culture really needs something, that's going to push for the invention of new things, new concepts, new tools, and the like. And this was no exception. And so, in trying to get an advantage over one side or the other, the longbow is invented. Some of the early kind of crude firearms are invented as a way of, again, the English lording it over the French, or the French lording over the English. But one of the unintended consequences of this is they discovered that the longbow and a kind of crude gun is also comes to be very easy for the populace to have. It's not a weapon that's controlled by the kings any longer. And to some degree, if you have enough money and you know the right people, anyone can get one of these things. So suddenly, if the king knows that the peasant village is full of people that have guns or longbows, they might have to think twice about taxing them and just kind of running roughshod over them. And so this idea of weapons falling into the hands of your ordinary peasant citizen was something terrifying for kings. But it also allows for kind of the peasantry, which were long considered peons compared to the royal family. Now suddenly they have a say in things because they can shoot back, so to speak. That's huge. Joan of Arc, the famous folk hero, is also from this era. And just a little bit about her story. And so she's a young French girl, a teenager. And she stands out as this kind of mystic figure. She claims that she has visions coming to her from God that are telling her that she needs to go and fight for her French homeland and to take it back from the English. And she was kind of held up then as kind of this standard of divinity, this idea that God is on our side. But also this very shocking idea that a teenage girl would dress in armor and take a sword and to lead out the army. She becomes kind of the spiritual mascot for the French. And at least early on, wherever she goes, the French seem to succeed. So they take her as kind of this divine token that is evidence that God is on their side. So King Charles VII of France sends her out at the ripe age of 17, along with the army, to rescue the city of Orleans that the French had besieged. And within 9 days, the siege is lifted and the French retake the city. And so this is again kind of it was a military rescue, but the credit is given to Joan, or at least God speaking through Joan. And so she becomes this a very important figure for kind of rallying the troops and raising morale. And so one victory follows after another. And so Charles the Seventh, he rushes to the city of Reims to be crowned officially king. And again, he claims rulership over both France and England. So he thinks that God is kind of rushing him to his victory. But right at the height of this, in 1431, Joan is captured, and she is betrayed and turned over to the English. And the English famously burn her at the stake on May 30th, 1431. Again, as a very young girl. I think she was 18 or 19 when this happens. Again, devastating to French morale. So Joan, this young girl, becomes kind of caught up in the political and religious and culture wars of this very turbulent era. All right, so just kind of a quick recap to kind of ground this, to give some foundation to this stuff. So again, this question: how could a century like this of chaos, division, and devastation set the stage for the individualism, humanism, and democratization of the Renaissance? Well, we've already seen a little bit of that. Some of these unintended consequences of things like this split in the church between the popes, of this massive 116-year war between the English and the French, have a kind of, when the dust settles, you start to see a little bit more kind of transfer of power away from the Pope, away from the kings, and now to the populace, whether that be they are now kind of voting in councils or they have weapons in their hands that cause leaders to think twice. The schism in the church, the Pope's no longer kind of at least not a all-powerful monarch. You start to see a shrinking influence of the Vatican over territory and political questions, local councils, community control. After the 100 Years' War, there's more kind of solidified boundaries, physical boundaries along kind of ethnic and linguistic lines, and you have this democratizing effect of widely available weaponry. So we'll see how this goes. And so all of these things, I think, can kind of start to topple dominoes, and that line of dominoes starts to fall into the 1400s and into the 1500s, where we do start to see kind of the foundation of things that we recognize later as kind of Republican democracy, of individual rights, kind of notions of equality. It doesn't matter, where you were born or who you were born to. This idea that all of human life has kind of equal dignity. I think it all starts, at least from kind of a Western point of view, it all starts here. But now, add to that, what about something like the Black Death, which I haven't mentioned yet, and this is what we'll end with in this lecture. So the Black Death, over kind of a 2-3 year period, actually absolutely devastates. This is right in the middle of that, right near the beginning of that 100 Years' War. This mysterious plague arrives in Europe, and it's thought was kind of born on ships via it spread from rats to human beings. To this day, historians and epidemiologists are still not exactly sure what this was. The bubonic plague, as it's sometimes called, has not gone away. It's still out there, and sometimes you'll read a stray report. It's mostly been eradicated, but sometimes a rare case will pop up. But they, of course, they had no way to deal with this back in the middle of the 14th century, and over these 3 years, this deadly plague roughly kills 20 million people in Europe, which at the time was about 1/3 of the total population of the continent. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that that kind of devastation? And it just spread like wildfire to the degree that it's called bubonic plague. A bubo is kind of a bump or a nodule that would kind of show up on your face or on your neck. And if that happened, if you saw that, basically you knew you were a goner. And if someone in your family was, the best that you could do was quarantine them in the house and kind of allow them to die this agonizing death. But you couldn't be near them because you would almost assuredly catch it and die yourself. And so it sweeps through the continent and just absolutely devastates it. And you can imagine the kind of blow that would had to this deeply Catholic community. Questions like, well, where's God in all of this, right? Why didn't God save us from this too? And so again, that I think it also results in kind of this pushback against the church. What good is the Pope if God can't save us from something like the bubonic plague? So it also kind of has this consequence of people asking questions that they'd never asked before, and that kind of stuff ripples out into kind of all corners of culture. And I think it's also responsible for some of the political changes and cultural changes and religious changes that happen in the 1400s and the 1500s. So here, yet even this horrific tragedy changes the culture in such a way that sets the stage for the flourishing culture of the Renaissance. And so in lectures next week, we'll continue to consider the question of why and how this happens. All right. Thank you for listening. I will see you next week.